I'm Frank Martinez, 72, and after surviving 2 tours in Vietnam and building a multi-million-dollar construction empire, I never thought my biggest battle would be against my own children. For the past 3 years, my own children have been calling me senile and confused whenever I mentioned my missing savings accounts. They'd exchange those knowing looks, whispering about Dad's deteriorating mind, while patting my hand condescendingly. But last Tuesday, while organizing my military records for the VA, I found something that proved I wasn't losing my memory at all. Hidden behind my Purple Heart certificate was a folder containing copies of financial documents I'd forgotten I'd made, bank statements, investment records, and property deeds that showed exactly where my $800,000 in savings had gone. My children weren't worried about my mental health. They were covering their tracks. And now I had the proof to expose everything they'd stolen from the man they claimed to love. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever been dismissed by family who underestimated you, hit that like button. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding how I built everything will help you see just how devastating it was to watch it all disappear. When I came home from Vietnam in 1971, I had $500 in my pocket, a Purple Heart, and a head full of nightmares that would take decades to quiet. Most guys my age were finishing college or already established in their careers. I was 23, scarred inside and out, and watching my buddies struggle to find their place in a world that didn't want to acknowledge what we'd been through. But I had Carmen, sweet Carmen Rodriguez, who'd waited for me through 2 tours and never once complained about the months between letters. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, a future worth fighting for. On our wedding day in 1972, she whispered in my ear, "We're going to build something beautiful together, Frank, something that lasts." And we did. With that $500 and a borrowed pickup truck, I started Martinez Construction. The original company charter, which I still keep in my filing cabinet, shows the date, March 15th, 1973. Carmen had insisted we make it official, even though I was doing mostly handyman jobs and small repairs. "Dreams need paperwork," she'd say, filing away every receipt and contract with the precision of a military quartermaster. Those first years were brutal. I'd work construction jobs during the day for other companies, learning the trade, then come home and work on side projects until midnight. Carmen would bring me coffee and sit with me while I calculated bids by hand, her presence the only thing that kept the war memories at bay. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. By 1980, we had our first child, Maria. I remember holding her in the hospital, this tiny, perfect thing, and making a promise that my children would never want for anything, that they'd never have to scramble and fight for every opportunity like I had. 3 years later came Carlos, my serious little boy who loved to help by organizing my tools. Then Sophia in 1985, our surprise baby who wrapped us all around her tiny finger from day one. The business grew with our family. Martinez Construction became known for quality work and fair pricing. We built custom homes, renovated historic buildings, and even landed a few commercial contracts. By the 1990s, we had 20 employees and were grossing over $500,000 a year. Carmen handled the books with the same precision she brought to everything, and I handled the job sites. But more than the money, I wanted to build security. Real security, the kind that meant my children could go to college without working 3 jobs like I had, the kind that meant Elena could retire early if she wanted, the kind that meant we'd leave something behind. So I saved, not just in the business accounts, but in separate savings accounts for each child. College funds that became wedding funds that became house down payment funds. I set up CDs and invested in safe, steady growth. By the time Carmen got sick in 2020, we had accumulated over $2 million in assets, the business, our home, and various savings accounts. Carmen made me promise, during those long nights in the hospital, that I'd take care of our children equally. "No favorites, Frank," she'd whisper, her voice already getting weak. "They're all good kids. They'll take care of you when I'm gone." I believed her. God help me, I believed her completely. After Carmen's funeral, the kids were so attentive. Maria, with her nursing background, insisted on checking my blood pressure weekly. Carlos took over more of the business operations, saying I deserved to finally enjoy retirement. Sophia called every day, sometimes twice, just to chat and make sure I was eating properly. I thought I was the luckiest father alive. I thought I'd raised children who would honor their mother's memory by staying close, by being the family she'd always dreamed of. Looking back now, I can see when things started to change. Little comments here and there. "Dad, are you sure you paid that bill? Or maybe you told me that story yesterday, not last week. Always said with such loving concern, such gentle worry." I should have seen it coming. In Vietnam, we learned to watch for signs of an ambush. But this was different. This was my own children, using my love for them as a weapon against me. Carlos had always been my responsible one. Even as a kid, he'd line up his toys in perfect rows and finish his homework before dinner. When he graduated with his business degree, I was so proud I could barely contain myself. My son, the first Martinez to get a college education, ready to take the family business to the next level. 6 months after Carmen's funeral, Carlos came to me with what he called a practical solution to a growing problem. "Dad," he said, settling into Carmen's favorite chair with a stack of papers, "we need to talk about your finances. I've been watching you struggle with the paperwork, and honestly, it's getting dangerous." I looked up from the bank statement. I'd been trying to reconcile. The numbers weren't adding up, and I'd been staring at them for an hour. "What do you mean, dangerous? You forgot to pay the property taxes last month. The electric company called me because your payment was 3 weeks late. And look at this checkbook." He held up my register, shaking his head with what looked like genuine concern. "Dad, some of these entries don't even make sense." My face burned with embarrassment. I had been having trouble keeping track of things since Carmen died. She'd always handled the day-to-day bills while I focused on the business accounts. Without her systematic approach, I felt lost in a sea of due dates and account numbers. "I can manage," I said, but even to my own ears, it sounded weak. "Of course, you can," Carlos said quickly, leaning forward with that earnest expression he'd perfected in college debate class. "But why should you have to? Dad, you've worked hard your entire life. You deserve to enjoy your retirement without worrying about which bill is due when." He spread the papers across the coffee table like a general, laying out battle plans. "I've done some research, and there's a simple solution. If you give me power of attorney over your financial accounts, I can handle all the paperwork, pay the bills, manage the investments, deal with the tax stuff. You'd still have complete access to your money, but you wouldn't have to stress about the administrative headaches." The power of attorney document looked official and intimidating, full of legal language that made my head spin. But Carlos walked me through it patiently, explaining each section in terms I could understand. "It's just like when you gave me signatory authority on the business accounts," he said. "Remember how much easier that made things? This is the same concept, just broader." That made sense. Carlos had been helping with Martinez Construction's finances for years, and he'd never given me reason to doubt his judgment. He'd actually increased our profit margins by negotiating better supplier contracts and streamlining our billing processes. "What about Maria and Sophia?" I asked. "Shouldn't they be involved in these decisions too?" Carlos nodded approvingly, as if I'd asked exactly the right question. "I'm glad you brought that up. We've already discussed it as a family. Maria thinks it's a great idea. She's seen too many elderly patients struggle with financial management, and she knows how stressful it can be. Sophia agrees that having one person coordinate everything makes more sense than trying to divide responsibilities. You've already talked about this without me. We were worried about approaching you too soon after Mom's death, Carlos said gently. We wanted to make sure you'd had time to grieve before dealing with practical matters. But Dad, it's been 6 months, and we can all see you're struggling. I signed the papers that afternoon. Carlos had thought of everything. He'd even arranged for a notary to come to the house so I wouldn't have to make a trip to the bank. As I watched him carefully file away the documents in his briefcase, I felt a mixture of relief and something I couldn't quite identify. Not regret exactly, but a sense that I'd crossed some invisible line. Don't worry about anything now, Dad, Carlos said, giving me a hug that felt different somehow, more formal. I'll set up automatic payments for all your regular bills, and I'll send you monthly statements so you can see exactly where everything stands. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks later. I went to withdraw $200 from my checking account and was told there were insufficient funds. That was impossible. I kept at least $5,000 in checking at all times, a habit Carmen had drilled into me years ago. When I called Carlos, he explained that he'd been optimizing my accounts by moving money into higher-yield investments. The checking account was just sitting there earning practically nothing, Dad. I moved most of it into a CD that'll give you much better returns. But I need access to my money, I said. Of course you do. Just call me when you need cash, and I'll transfer whatever you need. It's not complicated. But it felt complicated. It felt like asking permission to spend my own money. When I tried to explain this to Carlos, he got that patient tone people use with children. Dad, this is exactly why we set up the power of attorney, so you wouldn't have to worry about these details. Trust me, this system is much more efficient. Over the next few months, the system became increasingly complex. Carlos consolidated my accounts, moved my investments to new brokers, and started handling all my correspondence with financial institutions. When I asked questions, he'd show me thick folders full of statements and documents that proved everything was being managed professionally. Look at these returns, he'd say, pointing to numbers I couldn't quite follow. Your portfolio has grown 12% since I took over. Mom would be so proud of how well we're taking care of you. The mention of Carmen always stopped my questions cold. Carlos knew exactly which buttons to push. But sometimes late at night, I'd lie awake wondering why I felt so anxious about money when supposedly everything was being handled so well. Why did I feel like a stranger in my own financial life? I'd tell myself Carlos was a good son, that he was trying to help. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger every time I had to ask permission to access my own accounts. The campaign against my memory started so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. It began with small corrections, gentle suggestions that maybe I was misremembering things. Dad, you already told me that story about the Henderson job site, Sophia would say with a fond smile. Just yesterday, actually. But I love hearing it. Again, are you sure that appointment was today? Maria would ask when I'd mention a doctor's visit. I have it written down as next Tuesday. Maybe we should double-check. Individual incidents meant nothing. Everyone gets dates confused sometimes, repeats stories, forgets small details. But when I started paying attention, I realized these corrections were happening daily. Someone was always questioning my version of events, always suggesting I might be confused. The family's concern crystallized 2 months after Carlos took over my finances. I'd been having trouble sleeping, partly because of the financial anxiety I couldn't quite name, partly because of the dreams that had started coming back. Vietnam dreams I hadn't had in years. During one of Maria's weekly wellness checks, she brought up my sleep problems with the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years working in geriatric nursing. "Dad, I've been noticing some concerning patterns," she said, pulling out a small notebook. "Memory lapses, confusion about dates and appointments, increased agitation, sleep disturbances. These can be early signs of cognitive decline." Cognitive decline. The words hit me like cold water. "It's nothing to panic about," Maria said quickly, but her professional demeanor was more frightening than panic would have been. "Mild cognitive impairment is incredibly common in men your age, especially those who've experienced trauma. Your military service, losing mom, the stress of retirement, all of these are risk factors." She showed me a medical assessment form she'd filled out, documenting incidents I barely remembered. According to her notes, I'd forgotten conversations, repeated questions, become confused about simple tasks. The clinical language made me sound like a case study rather than her father. "I think we should have you evaluated," Maria continued, "just to establish a baseline. There are medications that can slow progression if we catch it early." The word progression made my stomach clench. "Progression to what? Your mother had similar concerns before she died," Carlos added from the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. "She mentioned to me that you seemed more forgetful, more confused about routine things." This was a lie. I knew it was a lie. Carmen had never said anything about my memory. If she'd had concerns, she would have talked to me directly. That was her way. But Carlos said it with such conviction, such sadness, that for a moment I doubted my own certainty. "Mom never said anything to me," I protested. "She wouldn't have," Sophia said gently. "She loved you too much to worry you unnecessarily. But she did ask me to keep an eye on you after she was gone." Another lie, but told with such tenderness that it felt like betrayal to question it. The fake medical assessment became their primary weapon. Whenever I challenged their decisions or questioned their management of my affairs, out would come Maria's notebook with its damning documentation of my supposed decline. "Dad, you asked me the same question 3 times in 10 minutes, she'd say with professional concern. "I wrote it down because I thought you should know. You were supposed to meet Carlos at the bank yesterday, but you forgot completely," Sophia would add. "We were worried sick." I'd find myself defending my mental competence to my own children, trying to prove I wasn't the confused old man they were painting me as. But how do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that you're not forgetting things, not getting confused, not declining into dementia? The more I protested, the more concerned they became. My anger at their accusations became evidence of increased agitation. My detailed memories of past events became perseveration on distant memories while neglecting recent ones. My questions about my finances became repetitive anxiety about matters already explained. They had an answer for everything, a clinical explanation for every behavior that challenged their narrative. The truly insidious part was how they presented their united front. Maria would document an incident, Carlos would corroborate it with his own observations, and Sophia would provide emotional support for how difficult this was for the whole family. They never contradicted each other, never showed doubt about their shared concern for my deteriorating condition. "We're not trying to take over your life, Dad," Carlos would say after another episode where I'd questioned his financial decisions. "We're trying to protect you from the stress of managing things that are becoming too complicated. You raised us to take care of family," Maria would add. "That's all we're trying to do. We love you too much to watch you struggle." Sophia would finish, often with tears in her eyes. "How do you argue against love? How do you fight people who claim they're only trying to help?" I began to second-guess myself constantly. Had I forgotten that conversation? Had I asked that question before? Was I becoming the confused old man they described, or was something else happening here? The doubt was the worst part. Not knowing whether my own perceptions could be trusted, whether my memory was reliable, whether my growing anger was justified, or just another symptom of decline. Late at night, alone in the house that no longer felt entirely mine, I'd try to piece together what was real and what wasn't. But doubt, once planted, grows like weeds. Every forgotten detail became evidence. Every moment of confusion became confirmation. They were very good at what they were doing, professional even, as if they'd researched the most effective ways to make someone question their own sanity. The dreams brought it all back. The clarity of combat, the brotherhood of soldiers, the absolute certainty of who you could trust and who you couldn't. In Vietnam, your life depended on reading people correctly. A false smile could mean an ambush. A friendly gesture could hide a grenade. I woke up one morning with my heart pounding and the taste of jungle humidity in my mouth, remembering the night I earned my Purple Heart. October 15th, 1969. Firebase Charlie, about 20 clicks south of Da Nang. The letter came back to me as I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to shake off the dream. Last month, while going through old papers, I'd found a letter from Tommy Nguyen, the combat photographer who'd been with our unit that night. He'd written it in 1995, 25 years after we'd served together, when he was working for a newspaper. In California, Frank, the letter had said, I've been thinking about that night at Firebase Charlie. I never told you this, but I got it all on film. You running back for Martinez and Kowalski when the mortars started falling, dragging them both to the bunker while the whole perimeter was getting overrun. Command said you carried Martinez 300 meters with shrapnel in your leg and Kowalski on your back unconscious. I've covered wars for 20 years since then, and I've never seen courage like that. Your kids should know what kind of man their father is. Reading that letter now, with my children's voices echoing in my head about my failing memory and declining capabilities, felt like discovering a message from another lifetime. The man Tommy described, decisive, brave, willing to risk everything. For his brothers, seemed like a stranger compared to the confused, dependent old man my children saw. But I remembered that night perfectly. Every detail was crystal clear, more vivid than yesterday's conversations with Carlos about my finances. We'd been under siege for 3 days. The North Vietnamese had us surrounded, probing our defenses, testing our weak points. That night, they hit us with everything: mortars, rockets, small arms fire. The noise was deafening, the muzzle flashes like deadly lightning in the darkness. When the mortars started falling inside the perimeter, I saw Martinez, Danny Martinez, 19 years old from El Paso, get hit by shrapnel. He was screaming, trying to crawl toward the bunker with his leg twisted at an impossible angle. Kowalski, our radio operator, was unconscious near the command post, blood streaming from his head. I didn't think. Thinking would have gotten us all killed. I ran. The first trip, I grabbed Danny under the arms and dragged him toward the bunker, his blood mixing with the mud, his screams lost in the chaos of incoming fire. Halfway there, something hot punched through my left thigh, spinning me around. Shrapnel from a mortar round. I kept moving, got Danny to the bunker, then turned around and ran back for Kowalski. He was heavier, dead weight, and I was losing blood fast. But you don't leave your brothers behind. That was the code, the only thing that mattered in that green. Hell. By the time I reached the bunker with Kowalski, my leg had gone numb. The medic later told me I'd lost almost 2 pints of blood. But both my brothers lived. Danny lost his leg below the knee, but he lived. Kowalski had a concussion that kept him dizzy for months, but he lived. The Purple Heart came later in a ceremony I barely remember. What I remember is the promise I made to myself in that hospital bed in Da Nang, listening to the sounds of helicopters bringing in more wounded. I promised that if I survived, I'd build something meaningful. I'd create a life that honored the Brothers who didn't make it home. That promise led me to Carmen, to the construction business, to the family I thought I'd built. Every house I constructed, every job I completed, every dollar I saved, it was all part of keeping that promise. I'd survived for a purpose. But now, sitting in my bedroom while my children systematically dismantled everything I'd built, I wondered if I'd survived the war, only to be destroyed by the people I'd fought to protect. The contrast was devastating. In Vietnam, I'd known exactly who I was and what I stood for. I'd been a leader, a protector, someone others counted on in the worst possible circumstances. The young soldiers in my unit had looked to me for guidance, for strength, for the kind of steady courage that kept people alive. Now my own children looked at me and saw weakness, confusion, decline. They saw someone who needed protection from his own decisions, management of his own affairs, supervision of his own life. How had I gone from saving lives under fire to being unable to manage my own checkbook, from being the rock that others clung to during the storm, to being the one who needed constant watching and worrying? The question haunted me because I knew the answer wasn't age or illness or natural decline. I'd been sharp until Carmen died. I'd been managing complex business, deals and financial decisions right up until Carlos took over. The confusion, the memory problems, the sense of being overwhelmed, they'd all started after my children began their campaign of concern. In Vietnam, we'd had a saying, the enemy isn't always the one shooting at you. Sometimes the real danger came from people who claimed to be on your side, who smiled and offered help while positioning themselves to take everything you had. I'd learned to recognize that kind of enemy in the jungle, but I'd forgotten the lesson in my own living room, disarmed by love and trust and the assumption that family meant safety. That morning, staring at Tommy's letter and remembering the weight of my brothers in my arms, I made a decision. The man who'd earned a Purple Heart at Firebase, Charlie, wasn't dead. He was just buried under months of manipulation and gaslighting. It was time to dig him out. Carmen's handwritten will was tucked away in our bedroom safe, exactly where she'd placed it 3 weeks before she died. I found it while looking for the deed to our house, another document that Carlos claimed needed updating for estate planning purposes. Her careful script filled 2 pages of legal paper, every word deliberate and clear. Carmen had always been meticulous about important matters, and her final wishes were no exception. As I read her words, I could hear her voice, steady and certain even in the face of death. To my beloved husband Frank, you gave me 48 years of love and partnership. Now I need you to promise me something. Our children, Maria, Carlos and Sofia, are to be treated equally in all things. No favorites, no exceptions. They each have different strengths, different needs, but they are equally our children and equally deserving of our love and support. She'd been specific about the financial arrangements. Each child was to receive an equal share of our assets after my death, with provisions for education funds, emergency support, and family assistance as needed during my lifetime. But the key phrase, underlined twice in her careful handwriting, was the one that made my hands shake as I read it. Frank must maintain full control of all assets and decisions during his lifetime. Our children are to be beneficiaries, not managers, of what we built together. Trust them to honor this, but don't make them responsible for choices that should remain yours. The will was dated February 10th, 2021, just 3 weeks before the cancer took her. Carmen had insisted on updating it even though she could barely hold a pen by then. I'd thought it was unnecessary. We'd had wills for years and nothing had really changed, but Carmen had been insistent. "Promise me, Frank," she'd whispered that last night in the hospital. "Promise me you'll take care of them equally, but promise me you'll never let them take care of you the way you're taking care of me. That's not their job. That's not how families are supposed to work." I'd been so focused on her words about treating the children equally that I'd missed the deeper warning. Carmen had seen something I was too grief-stricken to notice. She'd known our children well enough to understand what might happen if they gained too much control too quickly. Reading her will now, I realized how completely I'd betrayed her trust, not just by signing over financial control to Carlos, but by allowing our children to rewrite the story of what she'd wanted. They'd been invoking her memory to justify their actions, claiming she'd been worried about my mental state, suggesting she'd wanted them to take over my care. But Carmen's written words told a different story. She'd wanted our children to be provided for, but she'd wanted me to remain the patriarch of the family, the one making decisions about our legacy. Our love story had started in 1970, when I was still trying to figure out how to be a civilian again. Carmen was working at the diner where I ate breakfast every morning, saving tips to go to nursing school. She had dreams bigger than that small town could hold, and somehow she saw potential in a broken-down veteran who barely talked to anyone. "You're not broken," she'd told me on our third date, when I tried to explain why I wasn't good relationship material. "You're just carrying heavy things. Let me help you set them down." She did help me set them down, piece by piece, year by year. When the nightmares came, she'd hold me until they passed. When the anger surfaced unexpectedly, she'd talk me through it with patience I didn't deserve. When I struggled to trust the world again, she became my bridge back to believing in goodness. We'd built everything together: the business, the house, the family, the fortune that was supposed to be our children's inheritance. Every major decision had been discussed at our kitchen table over coffee. Every dream shared and refined until it became reality. Carmen had been my partner in the truest sense, not just my wife, but my business advisor, my moral compass, my fiercest defender when the world seemed stacked against us. She'd believed in my potential when I couldn't see it myself, and she'd never once suggested I wasn't capable of managing our life together. The children had adored her, of course. Carmen was the heart of our family, the one who remembered birthdays and organized holidays and made sure everyone felt included and loved. But she'd also been clear about boundaries. She'd expected them to be independent, to build their own lives, to contribute to the family rather than simply benefit from it. "We're raising them to fly away from us," she'd say, when they were teenagers testing limits, "not to perch on our shoulders forever." Now, holding her will and remembering her words, I understood what I'd lost when I signed that power of attorney. Not just control of my finances, but the respect Carmen had always insisted our children show me. She'd never allowed them to treat me as anything less than the head of our household, the man who'd built the foundation their lives rested on. In the months since her death, I'd been so desperate to maintain connection with our children that I'd accepted a diminished role in my own life. I'd let grief make me weak, let loneliness make me dependent, let love make me foolish. Carmen would have been furious, not at our children for trying to take advantage, but at me for letting them. She'd raised them better than that, and she'd married a man stronger than that, Frank Martinez. I could almost hear her saying, "You didn't survive Vietnam and build a fortune to end up begging your own children for permission to spend your money. Remember who you are." The safe also contained our original marriage certificate, photos from our wedding, and letters I'd written her from Vietnam. Evidence of a partnership that had weathered every storm, survived every challenge, built something lasting and beautiful. I was dishonoring that partnership by letting our children rewrite our story. Carmen deserved better. Our marriage deserved better. And somewhere deep inside, the man she'd fallen in love with deserved better too. The VA disability payment should have been automatic. Every month for the past 15 years, $1,847 had been deposited directly into my Veterans Administration savings account. Compensation for the shrapnel wounds and hearing loss from my service. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine, earned through sacrifice most people couldn't imagine. When I tried to check the balance that Tuesday morning, the account was gone. Not empty. Gone. as if it had never existed. I called the bank 3 times, convinced there'd been some mistake. The customer service representative was patient with me the first 2 calls, but by the third, I could hear the subtle condescension in her voice, the tone people use with confused elderly customers who can't keep track of their own accounts. "Sir, according to our records, that account was closed 6 months ago. All funds were transferred to your primary checking account per the power of attorney authorization." "What power of attorney authorization?" "The document filed by Carlos Martinez in September. He has full authority over all your financial accounts." The room started spinning. 6 months ago was just 3 months after I'd signed the power of attorney. Carlos had waited exactly 90 days before making his first major move. When I confronted him that evening, Carlos was ready with explanations that sounded perfectly reasonable and completely rehearsed. "Dad, I told you I was consolidating your accounts for tax purposes," he said, spreading papers across the dining room table with the confidence of a teacher addressing a slow student. "The VA account was earning practically nothing in interest. I moved those funds into your main checking account and then invested them in a high-yield CD that's earning 4.2% annually." "I want to see the CD." "Of course." Carlos pulled out a folder and showed me a certificate of deposit for 33,032s, roughly what should have been in the VA account. "See? Same money, better returns. This is exactly the kind of optimization I've been doing across all your accounts." The numbers looked right, but something felt wrong. "Why didn't you ask me before closing the VA account?" "I did ask you. Remember, when we had lunch at Denny's last month? You said to handle it however I thought best." "I didn't remember that conversation, but lately I didn't trust my memory about anything. Maria had been documenting so many incidents of forgetfulness that I'd started questioning every recollection." "Dad," Maria said, appearing in the doorway as if she'd been listening from the kitchen, "you seem really agitated about this. Is everything okay?" "I'm not agitated," I snapped. "I'm asking legitimate questions about my own money." Maria and Carlos exchanged one of their looks, the kind that said more than words ever could. Maria pulled out her ever-present notebook. "It's just that you've asked Carlos about the VA account 3 times this week," she said gently. We explained. "About the consolidation on Sunday and again yesterday. I'm worried that the stress is affecting your memory." "I haven't asked about it 3 times. "You did, Dad," Sophia said, joining the family intervention that seemed to materialize whenever. I challenged their narrative. "Yesterday you called Carlos at work about it. He spent 20 minutes explaining the same thing, 3 against 1. Always 3 against 1, with identical stories and matching concern. I was starting to understand how prisoners of war broke. Under interrogation, not through torture, but through the constant, relentless undermining of their own perceptions." "Look," Carlos said, adopting his most patient tone, "I understand why you're confused. Managing money gets more complicated as we age, especially when you're dealing with grief and adjustment. That's exactly why we set up the power of attorney, so you wouldn't have to stress about these details, but I want to stress about them," I said. "They're my details." "Dad," Maria said, making a note in her book, "getting upset about things that have already been explained to you is exactly the kind of pattern we've been seeing. Maybe we should schedule that appointment with Dr. Henderson to discuss your memory concerns." Dr. Henderson. Maria had been pushing for me to see a neurologist for months, convinced I was showing signs of dementia. Every question I asked, every challenge I raised became more evidence for her case that I was declining cognitively. But I wasn't declining. I was being systematically isolated from my own financial life, cut off from information, fed explanations that didn't quite add up, and then gaslit when I asked for clarification. "I don't need a neurologist," I said. "I need transparency." "You have transparency," Carlos said, holding up the folder of documents. Every transaction, every investment, every account change is documented right here. You have complete access to all information. Then why do I feel like I'm begging for details about my own money? Because you're asking the same questions repeatedly, instead of trusting the answers, Sophia said softly. Dad, we love you. We're trying to help you, but you have to let us help. That phrase, you have to let us help, had become the family motto. Every time I expressed concern, every time I asked questions, every time I tried to maintain some control over my own life, it came back to my need to let them help. But their help felt like drowning. Every month, I had less access to my own accounts, less understanding of my own financial situation, less autonomy in my own life. I was becoming a guest in my own existence, dependent on my children's explanations for what was happening with the money I'd spent 50 years accumulating. The original VA account passbook was still in my desk drawer, physical proof that the account had existed, that the monthly deposits had been real, that I wasn't imagining things. But when I showed it to Carlos, he just nodded sympathetically. Of course it existed, Dad. That's the account we consolidated. You can see the final balance on the closure statement, $33,132, exactly what we invested in the CD. Everything always added up in Carlos's explanations. Every number had a destination. Every transaction had a purpose. Every decision had been discussed and approved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a magic show. Lots of impressive sleight of hand, designed to distract me from what was really happening. The problem was, I couldn't prove what was really happening. Every time I tried to pin down my suspicions, Carlos had documents and explanations that made me look foolish for doubting him, and every time I looked foolish, Maria made another note in her book about my increasing paranoia and confusion. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived next door for 23 years. She'd been Carmen's closest friend, the kind of neighbor who brought soup when you were sick and watched your house when you traveled. If anyone understood our family dynamics, it was Elena Rodriguez. I was checking the mail when she approached me, her weathered face creased with concern. Frank, I hope you don't mind me saying something, but I've been worried about you. Everyone seems worried about me these days, I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. That's exactly what concerns me. Elena glanced toward my house, where Carlos's car was parked in the driveway. I've seen a lot in my 78 years, Frank. I've watched families go through difficult times. What I'm seeing here... She paused, choosing her words carefully. It reminds me of what happened to my sister Rosa. I knew about Rosa. Elena had told Carmen and me the story years ago, how Rosa's son had gradually taken control of her finances after her husband died, how he'd convinced everyone that Rosa was becoming incompetent, how he'd managed to transfer most of her assets to himself before Rosa's other children realized what was happening. Rosa wasn't incompetent, Elena continued. She was grieving and lonely, and her son took advantage of that. By the time the family figured out what was going on, Rosa was living in a tiny apartment, dependent on Social Security, while her son was living in her house and spending her savings. This is different, I said automatically. My children love me. They're trying to help. Rosa's son loved her too, Elena said quietly. That's what makes it so hard to see. Love and exploitation aren't mutually exclusive, Frank. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who convince themselves they're helping. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This came to my house by mistake yesterday. The mailman mixed up our addresses. It was a property tax assessment for my house. I opened it expecting to see the usual annual evaluation, but what I found made my blood run cold. According to the county records, the house was no longer owned by Frank Martinez. It was owned by Carlos Martinez. "When did this happen?" I whispered. "Staring at the document. That's what I was hoping you could tell me," Elena said. "Frank, if you didn't authorize this transfer, if you don't remember signing papers to put the house in Carlos's name—" I couldn't finish her sentence because I couldn't breathe. The house Carmen and I had bought in 1978, the house we'd raised our children in, the house where we'd planned to grow old together. It wasn't mine anymore. "There must be some mistake," I said. But even as I spoke, I was remembering a stack of papers Carlos had brought me to sign a few months ago. Estate planning documents, he'd called them. Routine paperwork to make sure everything transfers smoothly when the time comes. I'd trusted him. I'd signed whatever he put in front of me because he was my son, because he had a business degree, because he'd explained it was all for my own good. "Frank," Eleanor said gently, "I worked in the county clerk's office for 30 years before I retired. I know what these documents mean. Your house has been transferred to Carlos outright, not as part of estate planning, not as a future inheritance. Right now, today, Carlos owns your house. The implications hit me like falling concrete. If Carlos owned the house, he could sell it. He could evict me. He could make decisions about my living situation without my input. I'd gone from homeowner to tenant in my own house without even realizing it. What should I do?" I asked. Elena looked around nervously, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Frank, I'm going to say something that might sound harsh, but I care about you too much not to say it. Your children are stealing from you. Maybe they've convinced themselves it's for your own good. Maybe they think they deserve it, but that's what's happening." "They would never, wouldn't they?" Elena interrupted. "Frank, when was the last time you made a financial decision without asking Carlos's permission? When was the last time you saw your own bank statements? When was the last time you felt like the head of your own household?" I couldn't answer any of those questions, and my silence was answer enough. "There are people who can help," Elena continued. "Elder abuse specialists, attorneys who understand these situations. But Frank, you have to want help. You have to stop making excuses for what's happening and face the truth about what your children are doing." "They're not abusing me," I protested. "They're just managing things. Managing things they have no right to manage," Elena said firmly. "Frank, Carmen would be heartbroken if she could see what's happening. You know that, don't you?" The mention of Carmen broke something inside me. Elena was right. Carmen would be furious, not just at our children for taking advantage, but at me for allowing it to happen. "I don't know how to fight them," I admitted. "Every time I ask questions, they make me feel like I'm the problem. Like I'm confused or paranoid or declining," Elena finished. "Frank, I've watched you for 23 years. You're the same sharp, capable man you've always been. A little sad since Carmen died, which is natural. A little uncertain about some things, which is normal when you're dealing with grief. But there's nothing wrong with your mind." She pressed a business card into my hand. "This is an attorney who helped my friend Margaret when her son was stealing her Social Security checks. He specializes in elder financial abuse. At least talk to him, Frank. At least find out what your options are." "What if I'm wrong?" I asked. "What if they really are just trying to help, and I'm being ungrateful?" Elena's expression softened. "Then you'll apologize and work things out. But Frank, what if you're right? What if they're counting on your love for them to keep you from protecting yourself? How much more are you willing to lose before you find out?" As I watched Elena walk back to her house, I looked at the property tax assessment again. My name was nowhere on the document. Legally, officially, I was homeless. I was living in my son's house, dependent on his generosity for shelter, eating, food he owned, sleeping in a bed that belonged to him. 50 years of hard work, 50 years of building and saving and planning, and I'd become a charity case in my own home. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stronger than confusion or hurt. I felt anger. Clean, clear, righteous anger at being played for a fool by the people I'd sacrificed everything to provide for. Elena was right. Carmen would be heartbroken, but more than that, she'd be ashamed of me for being such an easy mark. It was time to stop being easy. I drove to the Henderson construction site on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Elena's warning about the house. It was supposed to be one of our biggest projects, a custom home Martinez Construction had been building for the past 8 months. I'd designed the foundation myself, supervised the early phases, took pride in the craftsmanship that had made our company's reputation. The sign was gone. Instead of Martinez Construction Building Dreams. Since 1973, there was a simple metal placard reading Henderson Residence, built by Summit Builders, LLC. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes, staring at that sign, trying to process what I was seeing. Summit Builders was a company I'd never heard of. Martinez Construction had been handling the Henderson project since last spring. The foreman was someone I'd worked with for 5 years, Jimmy Carlson, a good man who'd started as a laborer and worked his way up to site supervisor. When he saw me walking toward the house, his face went pale. "Mr. Martinez," he said, removing his hard hat, I wasn't expecting you. Jimmy, what's going on here? Where's our company's sign?" Jimmy looked around nervously, as if he was afraid of being overheard. "Sir, I thought you knew. The company sold last month. We all got letters saying Martinez Construction had been acquired by Summit Builders and that our employment would continue under the new ownership." "Sold?" The word came out as a whisper. "Who told you it was sold?" "Carlos, sir. He called a meeting with all the crew chiefs and supervisors. Said you'd decided to retire completely, that the family had made the difficult decision to sell the business rather than try to run it without you." The ground seemed to shift under my feet. Martinez Construction was more than a business. It was my legacy, my life's work, the foundation everything else was built on. Carmen and I had poured our hearts into that company for 50 years. "Jimmy," I said carefully, "when exactly did this meeting happen?" "October 15th. Carlos said you were too emotional about the sale to handle the transition yourself, but that you wanted him to make sure all the employees were taken care of." October 15th, 2 months ago, while I was supposedly experiencing memory problems and declining mental capacity, my son had been orchestrating the sale of my life's work. What happened to the equipment, the trucks, the office? Jimmy's discomfort was obvious. Sold with the company, mostly. Some of the smaller tools and equipment went to Carlos's house, he said, for storage. The office lease was transferred to Summit. And the contracts? The ongoing projects? All transferred to Summit. They kept most of us on, so the work continued without interruption. Carlos said that was important to you, that the clients wouldn't be affected. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Jimmy by the shoulders and tell him that I'd never authorized any sale, never agreed to retire, never signed papers, transferring 40 years of hard work to some company I'd never heard of. But Jimmy was just an employee doing his job. He had no reason to doubt what Carlos had told him. "Jimmy, I need you to tell me exactly what Carlos said at that meeting." "Sir, are you sure you want to go through all this? I mean, Carlos said the decision was really hard on you, that you'd been struggling with the business side of things since Mrs. Martinez passed." Another lie. Another story about my declining capabilities used to justify decisions I'd never made. "Just tell me what he said." Jimmy sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "He said you'd been having trouble keeping track of contracts and deadlines, that you'd made some mistakes that could have cost the company big money. He said the family had been worried about liability issues if something went wrong and you were held responsible. What kind of mistakes? He didn't get specific, just said there had been some problems with permits and inspections, maybe some safety violations that could have led to lawsuits." He made it sound like selling was the only way to protect you from potential legal trouble. More lies, built on the foundation of the memory problems my children had been documenting. Every forgotten conversation, every moment of confusion they'd noted and exaggerated, had been used to construct a narrative that justified taking everything I'd built. Who bought the company? Jimmy hesitated. Sir, maybe you should talk to Carlos about this. I don't feel comfortable. Jimmy, I'm asking you a direct question about my own company. Technically, it wasn't your company anymore when the sale happened. Carlos said you'd transferred ownership to him 6 months earlier as part of estate planning. The sale went through him. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The power of attorney had given Carlos access to my accounts. The estate planning documents had transferred ownership of my assets, including the business, to him. Once he controlled everything, he could sell it all without my knowledge or consent. Do you have any paperwork from the sale? Any documents with details about the buyer? Jimmy looked around nervously again. Mr. Martinez, I'm not supposed to discuss the business details since you're no longer involved with the company. Since I'm no longer involved with the company I built with my own hands. The hurt in my voice must have reached him. Jimmy pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos. I took a picture of the purchase agreement that Carlos showed us, just for my own records, you understand, in case there were questions about our employment status. The image on his phone made my heart stop. The purchase agreement showed Martinez Construction being sold to Summit Builders LLC for $1.2 million. The seller was listed as Carlos Martinez, president and owner. The sale date was October 1st, 2 weeks before Carlos had told the employees, but it was the buyer information that made me grab Jimmy's arm. Can you zoom in on that section? Summit Builders LLC, President Carlos Martinez, registered address, the same address as my house, the house that was now also in Carlos's name. Jimmy, I said slowly, do you understand what this means? Jimmy studied the document on his phone, and I watched comprehension dawn on his face. He sold the company to himself. He sold my company to a shell corporation he created, probably for a fraction of its real value. Then he can liquidate the assets, pay himself whatever salary he wants, and keep all the profits. But that's fraud, isn't it? It was fraud. It was theft. It was the systematic looting of everything I'd spent my life building, disguised as family concern and justified by lies about my mental decline. Jimmy, I need you to send me that photo. And I need you to think very carefully about whether you'd be willing to testify about what Carlos told you and when. Testify! Mr. Martinez, I don't want to get involved in family problems. This isn't a family problem anymore, Jimmy. This is a crime. As I drove away from the construction site, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Vietnam. The cold, focused clarity that comes when you finally understand who your enemy is and what you're fighting for. Carlos hadn't just stolen my money or my house. He'd stolen my identity, my life's work, the legacy I'd planned to leave my children. He'd used my love for him as a weapon against me, and he'd turned my other children into accomplices in my own destruction. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the man he was stealing from. The same determination that had built Martinez Construction from nothing was about to be turned against him. The war had taught me that the most dangerous enemies were the ones who looked like friends, but it had also taught me how to fight back when survival was at stake. Carlos was about to learn what happened when you cornered a combat veteran who had nothing left to lose. My grandson Miguel had been trying to teach me about computers for months. Abuelo, he'd say with the patient exasperation of a 16-year-old, you need to get with the times. Everything's digital now. Carmen had handled most of our technology needs, but since her death, Miguel had taken it upon himself to drag me into the 21st century. He'd set up an email account for me, shown me how to video chat with distant relatives, and patiently explained the basics of internet navigation. The key thing to remember, he'd said during his last visit, is that once something's written in an email, it never really goes away. Even if people delete it, there are usually copies somewhere. I thought it was just teenage wisdom at the time. Now, sitting at the computer he'd helped me set up, I realized it might be the key to everything. I'd been trying to access my old business email account, one Carlos claimed had been migrated during the company sale, but Miguel had written down all my passwords in a little notebook, and the old Martinez construction email was still active. What I found in my inbox made my hands shake. The first email was from September 15th, 3 weeks after I'd signed the power of attorney. The sender was Carlos, but the message wasn't addressed to me. It was part of a thread between Carlos, Maria, and Sophia. A thread I'd apparently been removed from. Phase 1 complete, Carlos had written. POA signed and filed. Dad was easier to convince than expected. The grief and isolation are working in our favor. Next step is the property transfers. Phase 1. They'd been running a planned operation against me, with phases and strategies like a military campaign. Maria's response was clinical and cold. Excellent. I've documented 6 more incidents of memory problems this week. The medical narrative is building nicely. Dr. Henderson has agreed to do the competency evaluation whenever we need it. Dr. Henderson was Maria's friend from nursing school, not an independent physician. They'd been planning to use a biased medical professional to declare me incompetent if I'd started asking too many questions. Sophia's contribution chilled me to the bone. I hate that we have to do this, but Mum's medical bills used up most of our inheritance already. Dad's too stubborn to go into assisted living voluntarily, and we can't afford to support him and our own families. This is the only way to secure our future. They'd been planning this since before Carmen died, while I'd been focused on caring. For my dying wife, my children had been calculating how to steal from me. The email thread continued for weeks, documenting their progress with the efficiency of a business report. Carlos updating them on financial transfers, Maria recording my supposed symptoms of decline, Sophia tracking my emotional state and social isolation. Dad asked about the VA account again, Carlos had written on October 3rd. Gave him the consolidation story. Maria documented it as repetitive questioning about resolved issues. If he keeps pushing, we might need to accelerate the incompetency timeline. The house transfer goes through next week, he'd written on October 10th. Dad signed everything without reading it. The grief and confusion angle is working perfectly. Business sale finalized, read an email from October 15th. Told the employees Dad was too emotional to handle the transition. No one questioned it. Dad has no idea the company's gone. But the most devastating email was from November 1st, just 2 weeks ago. Dad's getting suspicious, Carlos had written. Neighbor lady might have said something about the house. We need to be ready to pull the trigger on the competency hearing if he starts making noise. Dr. Henderson is standing by. I can have him committed for evaluation within 24 hours if necessary. Maria had responded. Once he's declared incompetent, we have complete control until the assets are fully transferred. How much longer do we need? Sophia had asked. 6 more months, Carlos had replied. By then, everything will be liquidated and distributed. Dad can have whatever's left for nursing home costs, whatever's left. They were planning to take everything and leave me with nothing but what they deemed sufficient for warehousing me in some institutional facility. The final email in the thread was from 3 days ago. Dad's been acting strange, Carlos had written. More defiant, asking too many questions. I think we need to move to Phase 3 sooner than planned. Phase 3. I scrolled through earlier emails to find what that meant. There it was, in a message from August. Phase 3. Competency hearing and guardianship. Once Dad's declared incompetent, we liquidate remaining assets and place him in managed care. Legal guardianship gives us complete control over his medical and financial decisions. They'd been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked away in a nursing home while they finished stealing everything I'd built, my own children. The babies I'd held in my arms, the kids I'd taught to ride bikes and helped with homework, the young adults I'd supported through college and early careers. They'd been systematically destroying me for months, and they'd documented every step of the process in writing, but they'd made a crucial error. In their arrogance, they'd created a digital paper trail that proved conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. Every email was time-stamped, every plan was documented, every lie was recorded. Miguel had been right. Once something was written digitally, it never really went away. I printed every email in the thread, 47 pages of evidence that proved my children weren't concerned family members trying to help a declining father. They were criminals who'd been planning my destruction for months, maybe years. As I sat in my kitchen, reading through their cold, calculating words, I felt the last of my parental love for them die. These weren't my children anymore. They were strangers who'd stolen my children's faces and used my memories of love to destroy me, but they'd miscalculated in one crucial way. They'd assumed that grief and isolation had made me weak, that age and confusion had made me helpless. They were about to learn what happened when you tried to destroy a man who'd survived war, built an empire, and discovered he had nothing left to lose except his dignity. The planning phase was over. It was time for Phase 4, their complete and total destruction. The VFW hall hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same wood paneling, same American flag, same smell of coffee and old cigarettes. But sitting in that familiar space, surrounded by men who'd shared the same hell I had, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt like myself again. Tommy Nguyen, the combat photographer who'd written me that letter, had driven down from Sacramento when I called. At 71, he was still sharp as a blade, his eyes still holding the alertness that kept soldiers alive in dangerous places. "Frank," he said, clasping my hand with both of his, "you sounded bad on the phone. What's going on?" I'd called an emergency meeting of what was left of our old unit. Just 4 of us now: Tommy, Joe Kowalski, the radio operator I'd carried to safety, Mike Santos from our demolition team, and myself. The others were either dead or too sick to travel. "I need help," I said simply. "And I need it from people who understand what real enemies look like." I spread the printed emails across the table and told them everything. The power of attorney, the gaslighting, the stolen accounts, the house transfer, the business sale, the plan to have me declared incompetent. As I talked, I watched their faces change from concern to disbelief to cold, military anger. "Jesus Christ, Frank," Joe said when I finished. "Your own kids?" "They're not my kids anymore," I said. "My kids would never do this. These are thieves wearing my children's faces." Tommy was studying the emails with the same intensity he'd once used to examine intelligence photos. "This is sophisticated," he said. "They've been planning this for months, maybe years. The psychological warfare, the documentation, the legal maneuvers. This isn't amateur hour." Mike Santos, who'd become a successful contractor after the war, was reading through the business sale documents. "Frank, do you understand what they've done here? They didn't just steal your company. They created a shell corporation to buy it from themselves. That's money laundering, fraud, probably racketeering if we can prove conspiracy." "We can prove conspiracy," I said, pointing to the email thread. "They documented everything." "Smart," Joe said, "but also stupid. They got so confident they forgot that evidence cuts both ways." Tommy leaned back in his chair, and I could see him shifting into the strategic thinking that had kept our unit alive. "Frank, you're not fighting family anymore. You're fighting criminals who happen to be related to you. That changes everything. What do you mean? I mean you stop thinking like a father and start thinking like a soldier. In Vietnam, we had rules of engagement when dealing with civilians, even hostile ones. But when someone was shooting at us, when they were trying to kill us, we responded with everything we had, Mike nodded. Your children crossed the line from family problems into criminal activity the moment they started forging documents and stealing assets. They declared war on you, Frank. Now you have to decide if you're going to fight back or let them win. I want to fight back, I said, but I don't know how. Every time I try to challenge them, they make me feel crazy. That's because you're still fighting on their battlefield, Joe said. They control the narrative in the family dynamic. But outside that dynamic, in the legal system, the evidence speaks for itself. Tommy pulled out a cell phone and started scrolling through contacts. I know someone who can help. Remember Jimmy Reyes from Alpha Company? He became a lawyer after the war, specializes in elder abuse cases. If anyone can make sense of this legal mess, it's Jimmy. Elder abuse, I repeated. The term felt strange applied to my situation. I was a combat veteran, a successful businessman, someone who'd survived war and built an empire. But legally, that's what this was, elder abuse by family members. Frank, Mike said, I need you to understand something. What your children are doing to you is exactly what the North Vietnamese tried to do to prisoners of war. Isolation, disorientation, making you doubt your own perceptions, using your emotions against you. The only difference is your children are doing it for money instead of military intelligence. The comparison hit me like a physical blow. My children had been using POW interrogation techniques against me, breaking down my mental defenses, making me question my own reality. In Vietnam, Tommy said, we had a code. Nobody fights alone. When one of us was in trouble, we all responded. That hasn't changed just because we're old men now. Joe reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. This is my son, David. He's a CPA, specializes in forensic accounting. He can trace every dollar your kids have stolen and document exactly how they did it. And this, Mike said, handing me another card, is my daughter, Lisa. She's a detective with the county sheriff's department. Elder financial abuse is one of her specialties. I stared at the cards, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not just hope, but the certainty that comes from having backup, from knowing you're not fighting alone. There's something else, Tommy said quietly. Something we all learned in Vietnam that applies here. When someone declares war on you, when they're trying to destroy you, mercy isn't kindness, it's stupidity. Your children aren't going to stop because you ask nicely. They're going to stop because you make them stop. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to hit them with everything you've got, all at once, before they can react. Legal action, criminal charges, asset recovery, media attention if necessary. Make it clear that they picked the wrong victim. The Veterans Group. Contact list was something we'd maintained for 50 years. Addresses, phone numbers, emergency contacts for all the men who'd served with us. Many were gone now, but the survivors included lawyers, accountants, investigators, business owners, and retired law enforcement officers. We're not just veterans, Joe said, studying the list. We're a network of professionals who've spent 50 years building expertise in different fields. Your children think they're fighting one confused old man. They're about to discover they're fighting a platoon of experts who know how to win wars. Tommy stood up and extended his hand. Frank Martinez, do you want our help taking your life back? I looked around the table at these men who'd shared foxholes with me, who'd risked their lives for me, who'd kept in touch for 50 years, because some bonds never break. Yes, I said, standing to shake his hand. I want my life back. Then consider. It done, Mike said. Operation Family Justice starts now. For the first time in months, I felt like the man who'd earned a Purple Heart at Firebase Charlie. I had allies, I had a plan, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My children had made the mistake of their lives. They'd declared war on a United States Marine who still had brothers willing to fight beside him. This was going to be a very short war. Jimmy Reyes met me at the First National Bank on Monday morning, carrying a briefcase and wearing the same focused expression he'd had when planning missions in Vietnam. 50 years of practicing law had refined his tactical thinking, but the core remained the same. Gather intelligence, assess the enemy's position, strike where they're weakest. "Frank," he said as we walked toward the bank entrance, "I've reviewed everything you sent me. What your children have done is textbook elder financial abuse, but proving it and recovering your assets are two different battles. Today, we start building the evidence." I'd spent the weekend preparing for this moment, gathering every document I could find, every password Miguel had written down, every piece of paper that might help reconstruct my financial life. But I was nervous. What if the banks wouldn't talk to me? What if Carlos had somehow blocked my access entirely? "Remember," Jimmy said, "you're not asking for favors. You're exercising your legal rights as an account holder. The power of attorney doesn't eliminate your rights. It adds Carlos's rights alongside yours." The first stop was my primary checking account, the one Carlos claimed to be managing for me. I presented my driver's license and military ID to the bank manager, a professional woman named Mrs. Patterson, who remembered me from the years when Carmen and I had done our banking in person. "Mr. Martinez," she said warmly, "it's good to see you. How can we help you today?" "I need to review all activity on my accounts for the past 12 months, I said. "Complete transaction history, copies of all authorizations, and documentation of any account changes or transfers." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted slightly. "Of course. Let me pull up your accounts." She typed for a moment, then frowned. "I'm showing that Carlos Martinez has been designated as the primary contact for these accounts. All statements and notifications have been redirected to his address." "I didn't authorize that redirection," I said. "It was done under the power of attorney authorization filed in September," she said, checking her computer. "But you're absolutely right. You still have full access to your account information." What she showed me next made my stomach drop. In the 12 months since Carmen's death, over $400,000 had been moved out of my accounts. Not stolen outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, there had been a steady stream of transfers, each one documented with a legitimate-sounding purpose: estate planning transfers, tax optimization moves, investment diversification, property maintenance funds. Carlos had been systematic, taking money in amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic bank alerts, always with explanations. That sounded reasonable to someone not paying close attention. "Mrs. Patterson," Jimmy said, "we need documentation of every one of these transfers, who authorized them, where the money went, what supporting documentation was provided." As Mrs. Patterson worked, I studied the transaction history. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Large transfers always happened on days when I'd been distracted, after medical appointments Maria had scheduled, during family visits that left me emotionally drained, on anniversaries of Carmen's death, when I was too grief-stricken to focus on finances. "Here's something interesting," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing to her screen. "This transfer of $85,000 to Martinez Property Holdings LLC was authorized with your signature, but the signature verification was waived because Carlos provided medical documentation stating you were experiencing cognitive difficulties." "What medical documentation?" "A letter from Dr. Sarah Henderson stating that you were experiencing mild cognitive impairment that affected your ability to handle complex financial transactions, but that you were still capable of providing consent with family assistance." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Dr. Henderson, Maria's nursing school friend, had provided the medical cover story that allowed Carlos to override normal banking security procedures. "I was never examined by Dr. Henderson," I told Mrs. Patterson. "I've never even met her." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. "Mr. Martinez, are you saying this medical documentation was fraudulent?" "I'm saying I need copies of everything, including that letter." The bank security footage was the smoking gun Jimmy had hoped to find. Mrs. Patterson explained that they maintained digital records of all significant transactions, including security camera footage from the dates when large transfers were authorized. "This footage shows Carlos Martinez at the teller window on October 8th, she said, pulling up the video on her computer. "He's presenting documents for the $125,000 transfer to Summit Builders LLC, the company that purchased your construction business." In the video, Carlos was calm, professional, acting every inch the responsible son, managing his father's affairs. But I wasn't with him. According to the paperwork, I had authorized the transfer that morning, but the timestamp showed Carlos at the bank during hours when I'd been at a doctor's appointment Maria had insisted I keep. "He forged my signature," I said, watching my son commit felony fraud on high-definition video. "It appears so," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Mr. Martinez, I'm required to report suspected fraudulent activity to our security department and to law enforcement." "Do it," I said. The second bank, where my business accounts had been held, provided even more damning evidence. Carlos had systematically transferred the company's assets to Summit Builders before the sale, effectively selling empty shell to himself and keeping all the valuable assets. The equipment, the contracts, the goodwill, even the company trucks, everything had been transferred to Summit Builders for $1 each, documented as corporate restructuring, authorized by the owner, Carlos Martinez. "This is a classic asset stripping operation," Jimmy explained as we reviewed the documents. He transferred ownership to himself using the power of attorney, then moved all the valuable assets to his shell corporation, then sold the empty company back to himself for a fraction of its real value. "How much did he steal?" Jimmy was adding numbers on his legal pad. "From what I can see so far, approximately $800,000 in liquid assets, plus the house valued at $400,000, plus the business assets worth at least $600,000. We're looking at theft of nearly $2 million. $2 million. 50 years of work, 50 years of building and saving and planning for my family's future, all stolen by the people it was meant to benefit. But the most valuable thing Jimmy found was the paper trail itself. Every fraudulent signature, every forged document, every false medical claim was documented and time-stamped. Carlos had been so confident in his plan that he'd left evidence everywhere. "Frank," Jimmy said as we left the second bank, "your children made a critical error. They got greedy and sloppy. If they'd just stolen a little bit, covered their tracks better, this would be almost impossible to prove. But they went for everything, and they documented every step of the process." "What happens now?" "Now we file a restraining order to freeze all remaining assets before they can steal anything else. Then we file criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Then we sue to recover every penny they've stolen." And then Jimmy's smile was cold and professional. "Then we destroy them so completely that no other family will ever try this again." As we walked to his car, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Vietnam, the satisfaction of superior intelligence gathering. We knew everything our enemies had done, when they'd done it, and how they'd done it. Carlos thought he was fighting a confused old man. He was about to discover he was fighting a combat veteran with the best legal representation money could buy, and evidence that would convict him in any court in America. The intelligence phase was complete. It was time for the assault. The courthouse. It felt like familiar territory, not because I'd been there before, but because it reminded me of Firebase Charlie, a place where battles were fought, where the prepared defeated the unprepared, where justice was decided by who had better intelligence and superior firepower. Jimmy had assembled what he called the nuclear option, a legal assault designed to hit my children from multiple directions simultaneously, giving them no time to react, regroup, or destroy evidence. "Surprise is our greatest advantage," he'd explained during our strategy session. "They think they have months to complete their plan. Instead, they're about to wake up to legal papers being served, assets frozen, and criminal investigations launched." The first document was an emergency restraining order to freeze all assets, every account Carlos controlled, every property he'd transferred to himself, every penny of the stolen money. Judge Martinez, no relation despite the name, had reviewed our evidence packet and granted the order within 48 hours. "This is extraordinary," the judge had said, according to Jimmy. "I've seen family financial disputes, but this level of systematic fraud is unprecedented. These restraining orders are granted immediately." The second document was a civil lawsuit demanding full restitution of all stolen assets, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. We were suing Carlos, Maria, and Sophia jointly for conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. The third document was the one that would destroy them, a formal criminal complaint filed with the district attorney's office requesting prosecution for forgery, fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. "Elder abuse is a felony in this state," Jimmy had explained, "especially when it involves this amount of money and this level of planning. Your children aren't just facing civil liability, they're facing prison time. I wanted to be there when the papers were served, not to gloat, but to see their faces when they realized their victim had become their prosecutor." The process server found Carlos at his office, the office he'd built with money stolen from me. According to Jimmy, who'd arranged for surveillance, Carlos had gone pale when handed the legal documents, then immediately called Maria and Sophia. "Emergency family meeting at your house," the private investigator reported, monitoring their phone calls with legal wiretap authorization. Carlos told them the old man has gone nuclear and they needed to coordinate their response. They arrived at my house, the house that legally belonged to Carlos, within an hour. I watched from the window as they sat in Carlos's car, reading through the legal papers, their faces growing more panicked by the page. When they finally came to the door, they weren't the concerned, loving children who'd been managing my decline. They were criminals who'd been caught red-handed, and they knew it. "Dad," Carlos said, his voice tight with controlled panic, "we need to talk." "No," I said calmly, "you need to listen." I let them into the living room, where Jimmy was waiting with boxes of evidence, bank records, email printouts, medical fraud documentation, and security footage from their various crimes. "Mr. Carlos Martinez," Jimmy said formally, "I'm James Reyes, representing your father in both civil and criminal matters. You've been served with restraining orders freezing all assets obtained through fraudulent means. You have 24 hours to provide complete financial records for all accounts and properties you've controlled on your father's behalf." "This is insane," Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad, what are you doing? We're family. We can work this out." "You're not my family," I said quietly. "My family wouldn't steal from me. My family wouldn't forge my signature. My family wouldn't plan to have me declared incompetent so they could steal everything I've built." Sophia started crying. "Daddy, we never meant to hurt you. We were just trying to help." "Help yourselves," Jimmy said, holding up the printed emails. "We have your entire conspiracy documented in your own words. Phase 1 complete." Dad was easier to convince than expected. "Does that sound like helping, Ms. Martinez?" Maria tried to fall back on her professional authority. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly. This lawyer is taking advantage of your confusion. We need to get you proper medical evaluation. I've already had one, I said, pulling out a folder. Dr. Williams at the VA hospital conducted a complete cognitive assessment yesterday. Perfect scores on every test, no signs of memory problems, no indications of mental decline. In fact, he said, my cognitive function is above average for someone my age. The competency evaluation had been Jimmy's idea. Get ahead of their narrative, he'd said. Prove your mental capacity before they can challenge it. Carlos was studying the restraining order, and I could see him calculating options, looking for escape routes. Dad, even if there were some irregularities in how I handled things, this is still a family matter. We don't need lawyers and courts. We can fix this ourselves, the way you fixed my missing $800,000. I asked. The way you fixed the house you stole, the way you fixed the business you sold to yourself. I didn't steal anything, Carlos said desperately. Everything I did was authorized under the power of attorney. I have documentation. Forged. Documentation, Jimmy interrupted, including fraudulent medical reports from Dr. Henderson, who we've already interviewed. She admitted that Maria asked her to write a letter about your father's cognitive decline without ever examining him. Maria's face went white. Dr. Henderson had been the weak link in their conspiracy, and she'd cracked under questioning from Jimmy's investigator. You have the right to remain silent, Jimmy continued, but anything you say can and will be used against you in court. And I strongly recommend you obtain separate legal representation because your interests are no longer aligned with each other's. That was the moment they realized their conspiracy was falling apart. When criminals face justice, they always turn on each other, each trying to minimize their own culpability by blaming their co-conspirators. This was Carlos's idea, Sophia said suddenly. He told us Dad was getting senile, that we needed to protect the family assets before he lost everything. Sophia, shut up, Carlos snapped. No, I won't shut up, Sophia shot back. You said it would be simple, that Dad would never find out. You said we deserved the money because we'd taken care of him. I documented medical concerns, Maria added, but Carlos told me what symptoms to look for. He said Dad was showing signs of dementia. You're all lying, Carlos said, but his voice was getting higher, more desperate. Dad, they're trying to make me the scapegoat. This was a family decision. We all agreed. We have the emails, Carlos, I said quietly. Every message, every plan, every lie you told, including the ones where you called me easier to convince than expected and discussed liquidating my assets. The restraining order was already in effect. Within hours, every account Carlos controlled would be frozen, every asset transfer reversed, every fraudulent transaction flagged for investigation. Mr. Martinez, Jimmy said to me, the district attorney will want to interview you tomorrow. They're very interested in prosecuting this case as an example to other families who might consider elder abuse. As my children, my former children, filed out of the house in defeat, Carlos turned back one last time. Dad, you're making a mistake. Family is forever. Lawyers and courts are temporary. You're right, I said. Family is forever. That's why this betrayal is unforgivable. After they left, Jimmy and I sat in the quiet house, surrounded by evidence of the most sophisticated elder abuse case he'd seen in 30 years of practice. How do you feel? He asked. Like a soldier who's just won the first battle of a war. I said, but the war isn't over yet. No, Jimmy agreed, but they don't have any weapons left and we have all the ammunition. Outside, I could see Carlos's car parked at the curb. My children inside arguing about whose fault it was that their perfect plan had collapsed. They'd forgotten the most important lesson from Vietnam. Never underestimate the enemy, especially when you've taught him everything he knows about fighting back. The court-ordered competency evaluation was scheduled for Friday morning at the County Medical Center. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a neuropsychologist with no connection to my family or their conspiracy, would conduct a comprehensive assessment of my mental capacity. This is their last desperate move, Jimmy had explained. They're going to claim you're incompetent to file these lawsuits, that your accusations are the result of paranoid delusions caused by dementia. Carlos had hired his own attorney, an expensive downtown lawyer named Harrison Blake, who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Blake had immediately filed a counter-motion claiming I was mentally unfit to make legal decisions and requesting emergency guardianship for Carlos. It's a Hail Mary pass, Jimmy said, but we need to be prepared for it. The morning of the evaluation, I arrived at the medical center to find my entire family waiting in the lobby. Not just Carlos, Maria, and Sophia, but their spouses, their children, even distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. "What's this?" I asked Jimmy. "Theater," he said grimly. "They're trying to create the impression of a concerned family united in worry about your mental state." Dr. Chen was a small, precise woman who treated the evaluation with scientific rigor. For 3 hours, she put me through cognitive tests, memory assessments, psychological evaluations, and interviews about my daily functioning. "Mr. Martinez," she said during one portion, "I understand there's been some family conflict about your financial decisions. Can you tell me about that?" I'd prepared for this question. Instead of launching into angry accusations, I calmly laid out the facts: the power of attorney, the missing money, the forged signatures, the fraudulent medical reports. I showed her the emails, the bank records, the evidence that proved systematic theft. "These are serious allegations," Dr. Chen said. "How do you feel about your children's actions?" "Disappointed," I said, "but not confused. I know exactly what they did, when they did it, and why they did it. My memory is fine, my judgment is sound, and my decision to seek legal recourse is entirely rational." When the testing was complete, Dr. Chen asked to interview my family members separately. Through the waiting room window, I watched Carlos, Maria, and Sophia take turns painting me as a confused, paranoid old man who'd become delusional since Carmen's death. But Dr. Chen was thorough. She also interviewed Elena Rodriguez, my neighbor, who testified about my clear thinking and justified suspicions. She spoke with Tommy Nguyen, who'd driven down from Sacramento to describe my strategic planning and military precision in gathering evidence. Most importantly, she interviewed Miguel, my grandson, who'd been caught in the middle of the family war. "Abuelo isn't crazy," I heard him tell Dr. Chen through the partially open door. "He's angry, and he should be angry. My dad and aunts have been lying about him for months." The competency evaluation report was completed that afternoon. Dr. Chen called Jimmy with the results before the formal report was filed. "Mr. Martinez shows no signs of cognitive impairment," she told him over speakerphone while I listened. "His memory is excellent, his judgment is sound, his emotional responses are appropriate to his circumstances. In fact, his cognitive function tests in the superior range for his age group." What about the family's claims of paranoid delusions? Mr. Martinez's accusations against his family members are supported by extensive documentation. His belief that he's been defrauded isn't a delusion, it's a reasonable conclusion based on evidence. If anything, his systematic gathering of proof demonstrates excellent executive function and strategic thinking. The report destroyed my children's last hope of having me declared incompetent, but it also triggered their complete breakdown as a family unit. That evening, Carlos called me in a rage. "You've destroyed our family," he screamed into the phone. "Mom would be ashamed of you for turning against your own children. Carmen would be ashamed of you for stealing from the man she loved," I replied calmly. "We never stole anything. We managed your affairs because you were incapable of doing it yourself." "Then explain the emails, Carlos. Explain phase 1 complete, and Dad was easier to convince than expected, and planning to liquidate my assets." Silence. "Then you had no right to read our private communications." You had no right to steal my life savings. We're your children. Everything you have should be ours anyway. And there it was, the truth finally coming out. Not concern for my welfare, not family duty, not love. Entitlement. The belief that my money belonged to them simply because they were my biological offspring. You're not my children anymore, I said quietly. You're criminals who happen to share my DNA. Maria tried a different approach, calling later that night in tears. Daddy, please, we can fix this. We'll pay back the money. We'll transfer everything back to your name. Just drop the criminal charges. Please don't send your own daughter to prison. You should have thought about prison before you committed felonies. But we're family. Family forgives each other. Family doesn't steal from each other in the first place. Sophia's call came after midnight, hysterical and incoherent. You're destroying my children's future, she sobbed. My husband wants to divorce me because of the criminal charges. I could lose my kids. Is that what you want? Is revenge more important than your grandchildren? Is money more important than your father? I asked. Because that's the choice you made. The next morning brought news that their unified front had completely collapsed. Jimmy's investigator reported that Carlos and Maria were blaming Sophia for going along too easily with the plan. Sophia and her husband were claiming they'd been manipulated by Carlos and knew nothing about the forged documents. Maria was trying to distance herself from the conspiracy by claiming she'd only documented medical observations, not participated in financial fraud. They're eating each other alive, Jimmy said with satisfaction. This is exactly what happens when a criminal conspiracy falls apart. Everyone scrambles to save themselves. But the most dramatic development came that afternoon. Miguel, my 16-year-old grandson, showed up at my door with a suitcase. Abuelo, he said, I can't live with them anymore. They spend all day talking about ways to get you declared crazy or how to hide money from the lawyers. My dad says, you're the enemy now. I told him, you're the only family member who's never lied to me. Having Miguel choose my side broke something inside me. Not sadness, relief. At least one member of the younger generation understood the difference between right and wrong. Your parents won't like this, I told him. I don't care, Miguel said. They're criminals, Abuelo. You taught me to stand up for what's right, remember? That evening, Carlos appeared at my door one final time, his face twisted with rage. You turned my own son against me, he said. I didn't turn him against you, I replied. You did that yourself when you chose to become a thief. This isn't over, Carlos said. Yes, it is, I said. You just don't know it yet. As I watched him drive away, probably for the last time, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, but sadness for the family that could have been. But some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. And some betrayals are too deep to forgive, even when forgiveness might feel like the noble choice. My children had declared war on me. Now they were learning what defeat looked like. District Attorney Patricia Williams was younger than I'd expected, but her reputation for prosecuting white-collar crime was legendary. When she called the case one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes her office had ever seen, I knew my children were facing serious prison time. Mr. Martinez, she said during our interview, I want you to understand what we're dealing with here. This isn't simple theft or family financial disputes. Your children engaged in a multi-year conspiracy involving forgery, fraud, identity theft, and systematic financial abuse. The evidence you've provided is overwhelming. The formal charges were filed on a Tuesday morning. 3 counts of elder financial abuse, multiple counts of forgery, fraud in the first degree, identity theft, and conspiracy. Each charge carried potential prison sentences measured in years, not months. Carlos Martinez faces the most serious charges, D.A. Williams explained, because he was the primary architect of the scheme. But Maria and Sophia are equally culpable as co-conspirators. The medical fraud alone could result in 5 years in state prison. The local newspaper picked up the story within hours. "Prominent family charged in elder abuse scheme," read the headline, along with details about the construction business sale and the systematic theft of assets. Within days, the story had spread to regional news outlets. My phone started ringing. Constantly, reporters wanting interviews, other elderly victims sharing similar stories, lawyers offering to help with additional lawsuits. The case had become a symbol of something larger than my personal situation. "Frank," Tommy called from Sacramento, "you're famous. The story made the evening news up here. They're calling it a wake-up call about elder abuse in families." But the media attention had consequences I hadn't anticipated. Carlos, Maria, and Sophia were being publicly shamed in a community where they'd lived their entire lives. Their friends, colleagues, and neighbors now knew they were accused criminals who'd stolen from their own father. Carlos lost his job when the bank learned about the criminal charges. Maria was suspended from her nursing position, pending investigation by the state licensing board. Sophia's husband filed for divorce, citing the criminal charges and media attention as incompatible with his career in education. "They're being destroyed," Elena Rodriguez told me during one of her visits. Carlos had to move out of his house because reporters keep showing up. Maria's neighbors won't speak to her. Sophia's children are being teased at school. I should have felt satisfaction at their suffering. Instead, I felt empty. These were still the children I'd raised, the babies I'd held, the young adults I'd supported through college and career struggles. Watching them face public disgrace and potential prison time didn't bring me joy. It brought a profound sadness for what we'd all lost. The asset recovery process moved quickly once the criminal charges were filed. The courts ordered immediate restitution of all stolen funds, plus interest and penalties. Carlos was forced to liquidate his personal assets to begin repaying what he'd stolen. "We've recovered approximately 60% of the stolen money so far," Jimmy reported during one of our weekly meetings. "The house transfer has been reversed, the business assets are being restored to your control, and the remaining funds should be recovered within 6 months. What about the business itself? Summit Builders LLC has been dissolved. Martinez Construction can be re-established under your control, though you'll need to rebuild the client relationships and employee base that Carlos destroyed." The idea of rebuilding the company at age 72 should have seemed overwhelming. Instead, it felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been stolen along with my money. But the most difficult part of the legal process was the victim impact statement I'd have to give at their sentencing hearing. D.A. Williams wanted me to describe how their actions had affected my life, to help the judge understand the full scope of the damage they'd caused. "It's not just about the money," I explained to her during our preparation session. "They stole my sense of security, my trust in family, my confidence in my own judgment. They made me question my memory, my mental capacity, my worth as a human being." "That's exactly what the judge needs to hear," she said. "Elder abuse isn't just financial crime. It's psychological torture designed to make victims feel helpless and dependent. Miguel had been living with me for 3 weeks, and his presence had been a surprising comfort. Having a family member who believed in me, who supported my fight for justice, reminded me that not all relationships had been poisoned by greed and betrayal. "Abuelo," he said one evening while we were reviewing legal documents, "I'm proud of you for fighting back. My friends think you're like a superhero or something, the old man who took down his own kids." "I'm not a superhero," I said. "I'm just someone who refused to be a victim." "That's what makes you a superhero." The plea bargain negotiations began in earnest after the competency evaluation report was filed. Carlos's expensive lawyer was pushing for reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and cooperation with the investigation. "They want to plea bargain Jimmy told me. Carlos would plead guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges in exchange for a suspended sentence and 5 years probation. Maria and Sophia would plead to lesser charges with community service and restitution. What do you think? I think they should face the full consequences of their actions. But I also understand if you want to avoid a public trial that would drag this out for another year. The decision was harder than I'd expected. Part of me wanted them to face maximum penalties, to serve prison time that would match the magnitude of their betrayal. But another part of me, the part that still remembered them as children, just wanted the nightmare to end. They destroyed our family, I said finally. The least they can do is face the consequences with some dignity instead of trying to negotiate their way out of responsibility. So, no plea bargain? No plea bargain. Let them explain to a jury why they thought it was acceptable to steal from their father. The trial date was set for 6 months in the future. Until then, my children would live under the shadow of pending felony charges, their reputations destroyed, their futures uncertain. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted for our family story, but it was the ending their choices had made inevitable. Sometimes justice doesn't feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like the painful but necessary amputation of something that's become too diseased to save. The asset recovery order came through on a cold December morning, 6 months after I'd first discovered the hidden documents behind my Purple Heart. Judge Martinez had reviewed the evidence, heard the testimony, and ordered complete restitution of all stolen funds plus interest and penalties. Total recovery, $847,000, Jimmy announced, spreading the court documents across my kitchen table. Carlos is being forced to liquidate his personal assets, including the house he bought with your money. Maria and Sophia have to surrender their shares of the business sale proceeds. Everything stolen is being returned. But the numbers on paper couldn't capture the human cost of my children's choices. Carlos had lost everything: his job, his house, his reputation, his family. The divorce proceedings Sophia had feared became reality when her husband couldn't handle the shame of being married to a convicted felon. Maria's nursing license had been permanently revoked, ending a career she'd spent 15 years building. They're getting what they deserve, Miguel said. But even at 16, he seemed to understand that justice sometimes felt hollow when it destroyed people you'd once loved. The most devastating consequence wasn't financial. It was the complete severing of family relationships. Carlos hadn't spoken to me since the criminal charges were filed. Maria had tried calling once, sobbing apologies I couldn't accept. Sophia had written a letter begging for forgiveness that I'd thrown away. Without reading, "Some bridges can't be rebuilt," Elena Rodriguez had said when I told her about Sophia's letter. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because trust, once completely destroyed, can't be restored. The business assets were easier to recover than the family relationships. Martinez Construction's equipment, contracts, and client relationships had been scattered when Carlos sold the company to himself, but the legal victory gave me the foundation to rebuild. "You could retire comfortably now," Jimmy pointed out. "You've recovered your money, you own your house free and clear, and you have enough assets to live well for the rest of your life." "I could," I agreed, "but I won't." The decision to restart Martinez Construction wasn't about money. It was about identity. For 50 years, I'd been Frank Martinez, builder of dreams, creator of homes, employer of good people who took pride in quality work. The theft had temporarily stolen that identity along with my savings. Jimmy Carlson, my former foreman, was the first person I called about rebuilding the company. "Mr. Martinez," he said when I reached him at his new job with a competing contractor, "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry about your family, but I'm glad you got your money back. Jimmy, how would you feel about helping me restart Martinez Construction?" There was a long pause. Sir, are you serious after everything that happened? Especially after everything that happened. Carlos may have stolen my money, but he didn't steal my knowledge or my reputation. Half our old clients have called asking when Martinez Construction would be back in business. Within 3 weeks, I'd re-established the company, leased new office space, and hired back 6 of my original employees. The first contract was a renovation project for the Henderson family, the same family whose house had been Carlos's last project before the theft was discovered. We want to work with the real Martinez Construction, Mrs. Henderson told me, not whatever that shell company was that Carlos created. But the most meaningful development came from an unexpected source. Miguel asked if he could work for the company during summer break, learning construction skills and business management. I want to understand how you built everything, he said. Maybe someday I can help rebuild what they destroyed. The idea of a new generation carrying on the Martinez Construction legacy, honestly this time, gave me hope I hadn't felt since Carmen's death. The criminal trial proceeded without the drama I'd expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and no credible defense, Carlos eventually accepted a plea bargain that included 3 years in state prison, 5 years probation, and complete restitution. Maria and Sofia received suspended sentences with community service and probation, but their professional licenses were permanently revoked. They avoided the maximum penalties, Jimmy explained, but they'll carry felony convictions for the rest of their lives. They'll never work in positions of financial trust again. The media attention gradually faded, but the case had become a landmark in elder abuse prosecution. District Attorney Williams used our story in training seminars for law enforcement, and several other families contacted me about similar situations with their own children. You've started something important, she told me during the final legal proceedings. Other victims are coming forward because they saw that it's possible to fight back and win. The financial recovery was complete, but the emotional recovery would take longer. Some nights, I'd lie awake remembering Christmas mornings when my children were young, birthday parties where we'd all laugh together, family vacations where love seemed unbreakable and permanent. But those memories belonged to different people, the children I'd raised, not the criminals they'd chosen to become. The theft hadn't just stolen my money. It had stolen my ability to remember them with love instead of betrayal. Do you think you'll ever forgive them? Elena asked one afternoon while we sat on my front porch, watching Miguel practice driving in the empty lot across the street. I don't know, I admitted. Forgiveness might be possible someday, but trust requires the possibility of future relationship, and I can't imagine ever feeling safe around them again. That's okay, Elena said. Forgiveness doesn't require relationship. Sometimes the healthiest thing is to forgive from a distance and move on with your life. The asset recovery order had given me back my financial security, but it had also given me something more valuable, proof that I wasn't the confused, declining old man my children had tried to make me believe I was. I was Frank Martinez, combat veteran, successful businessman, and survivor. I'd built an empire once, lost it to betrayal, and built it again through determination and justice. At 72 years old, I was just getting started on the next chapter of my life, and this time I'd write it entirely on my own terms, the new will. And testament sat on my desk like a map to a different future. This time there would be no ambiguity, no loopholes, no opportunities for manipulation. Jimmy had crafted a document that protected my assets with military precision, while ensuring my wishes would be honored exactly as written. The key difference, he explained, is the inclusion of specific anti-fraud provisions. Anyone who contests this will or challenges your mental capacity automatically forfeits their inheritance. The document also establishes an independent trustee who can't be influenced by family pressure. Miguel would inherit the bulk of my estate, along with several veterans' charities and the scholarship fund I'd established in Carmen's name. Carlos, Maria and Sofia were specifically mentioned and specifically excluded, with detailed explanations of why their criminal actions had disqualified them from any inheritance. "It might seem harsh," Jimmy said, "but it prevents future legal challenges and makes your intentions crystal clear." "It's not harsh," I replied. "It's honest. The process of rebuilding Martinez construction had given my life new purpose. 72. I was working longer hours than I had in years, driven by something stronger than necessity, the determination to prove that what they'd stolen couldn't break what I'd built inside myself. The new office was smaller than our old headquarters, but it felt more authentic somehow. No corporate ambitions or expansion dreams, just quality work and honest dealing. We specialized in renovation projects and custom homes, the kind of detailed craftsmanship that had made our reputation decades earlier. "It's like starting over," Jimmy Carlson said during one of our weekly project meetings, but with 50 years of experience behind us, Miguel had become my unofficial apprentice, working after school and weekends to learn every aspect of the business. At 16, he already understood that construction wasn't just about building structures, it was about creating something that would outlast the people who built it. "Abuelo," he said one afternoon while we reviewed blueprints for a new custom home, "why did they do it? My dad and aunts, I mean. You gave them everything growing up." It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. "I think they confused what I gave them with what they earned," I said finally. "They started believing they deserved my money, simply because they were my children, not because they'd worked for it or honored the values that built it. Will you ever speak to them again?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me hopes they'll find a way to rebuild their lives honestly, but part of me knows that some betrayals cut too deep to heal completely." The weekly meetings with my Vietnam veteran support group had become a lifeline during the rebuilding process. These men understood something that civilians often missed, that surviving betrayal required the same mental toughness as surviving combat. "The hardest part," Tommy Nguyen said during one of our sessions, "isn't the financial loss. It's learning to trust your own judgment again after people you loved convinced you that you were losing your mind." Joe Kowalski nodded. "Frank, you did something most victims of elder abuse never manage. You fought back and won, but now you have to figure out how to live with the victory." The victory felt different than I'd expected. There was satisfaction in seeing justice done, relief in having my assets restored, pride in rebuilding what had been destroyed. But there was also loneliness, the ache of family relationships that could never be repaired. Carmen's memory had become my compass during the rebuilding process, not just her specific wishes in the will, but her values, her approach to family, her belief in treating people fairly while holding them accountable for their choices. "She would have been proud of you for fighting back," Elena Rodriguez said one evening while we watched Miguel and some friends play basketball in the driveway. "But she would have been heartbroken about what forced you to fight." "I think about that a lot," I said, "whether I should have handled things differently, found some way to preserve the family relationships while still protecting myself." "Frank, you tried to preserve those relationships for months while they were stealing from you. They made the choice to destroy the family when they chose crime over love. The elder abuse prevention work had started almost accidentally. After the trial made news, other families contacted me about similar situations. Some were in the early stages of financial exploitation. Others had already lost everything and didn't know how to fight back. "You've become a symbol," Jimmy said when I told him about the calls I'd been receiving. "People see that it's possible to stand up to family members who are stealing from them. The most rewarding case was helping Margaret Santos, an 78-year-old widow whose son had been systematically draining her savings using a power of attorney she'd signed during a health scare. With our guidance and Jimmy's legal expertise, she was able to recover most of her stolen money and get her son prosecuted for elder abuse. I thought I was crazy, she told me after the case was resolved. My own son kept telling me I was forgetting things, getting confused. If I hadn't heard your story on the news, I never would have realized what was happening. That's when I knew I'd found my next mission, not just rebuilding my own life, but helping other elderly people recognize and fight back against family exploitation. The scholarship fund in Carmen's name had grown beyond what I'd originally planned. Every month, I added money from Martinez, construction's profits, building an endowment that would help deserving students pursue nursing careers, the profession Carmen had always admired. "Mom would love this," Miguel said when I showed him the scholarship fund documentation. She always talked about becoming a nurse before she met Abuelo. "Your great-grandmother understood that the best way to honor someone's memory is to continue their work in the world," I told him. "Carmen believed in helping people heal. This scholarship does that long after she's gone. The physical rebuilding was going well, but the emotional rebuilding remained a work in progress. Some days I felt strong and vindicated, proud of what I'd accomplished and excited about the future. Other days, I felt profound sadness for the family that could have been, the relationships that had been destroyed by greed and betrayal. Healing isn't linear," the counselor at the Veterans Center had explained. "Some days, you'll feel like you've completely moved past the trauma. Other days, it will feel fresh and overwhelming. Both responses are normal." The hardest moments came during holidays and family occasions. Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries, times when the absence of my children felt like a physical weight. Miguel helped fill some of that emptiness, but nothing could completely replace the family bonds that had been severed. "Do you think they miss you?" Miguel asked one evening. "I think they miss the man they thought they could manipulate," I said. "I don't think they ever really knew the man I actually am." 6 months after the asset recovery order was finalized, I was financially stronger than I'd been before the theft. The forced liquidation and rebuilding had eliminated inefficiencies in my investments and business operations. Martinez Construction was smaller, but more profitable. My personal finances were more secure and better protected. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the reclamation of my identity as a man who wouldn't be victimized, who could still fight for what was right, who could build something meaningful even after devastating loss. At 72, I'd learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to fight back, and never too late to choose dignity over family. At peace. The Elder Abuse Prevention Foundation charter arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after I'd found those hidden documents behind my Purple Heart. The state had approved our non-profit status, giving official recognition to the mission that had emerged from my personal battle. "The Martinez Foundation for Elder Financial Protection," I read aloud to Miguel as we sat in the new foundation office. "It has a nice ring to it." Miguel smiled. "Abuelo, you realize you've turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into something that will help thousands of people?" The Foundation's mission was simple but powerful. Provide education, legal resources, and support networks for elderly people facing financial exploitation by family members. We offered free consultations, referrals to elder law attorneys, and, most importantly, the message that victims could fight back and win. Our first major event was a seminar at the Veterans Center, where I shared my story with an audience of military retirees and their families. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people approached me afterward with their own stories of financial abuse, manipulation, and family betrayal. I thought I was the only one. said a 74-year-old Navy veteran whose daughter had been stealing his disability payments. I thought maybe I really was getting senile like she kept telling me. You're not alone, I told him, and you're not crazy. Family exploitation is more common than people realize because victims are ashamed to report it. Tommy Nguyen had driven down from Sacramento for the seminar, bringing with him 3 other Vietnam veterans who'd experienced similar financial abuse by their adult children. Frank, he said during the informal gathering afterward, you've started something that's bigger than your personal situation. This foundation could be your most important legacy. The foundation's first year was a learning experience. We helped 43 families recover stolen assets, provided legal referrals to over 100 people, and gave educational presentations to elderly communities throughout the region. But more than the numbers, what mattered was the message we were spreading. Elderly people didn't have to accept victimization, even from their own families. Maria called me 6 months after the foundation launched. It was our first conversation since the criminal charges were filed, and her voice sounded hollow, defeated. Dad, she said, I saw the news story about your foundation. I wanted you to know, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it. Why? I asked. Why did you do it? I don't know, she whispered. Carlos made it sound so reasonable, so necessary. He said you were declining, that we needed to protect you from yourself. By the time I realized what we were really doing, it felt too late to stop. It's never too late to stop, Maria. It's only too late to undo. I know that now. I lost my nursing license, my career, most of my friends, but I deserved all of that. What I can't live with is knowing I hurt you. Then live with it, I said quietly. Let it motivate you to make better choices going forward. Do you think someday we could try to rebuild our relationship? I was quiet for a long time. I don't know, Maria. The trust is gone, and I don't know if it can be rebuilt. But I hope you can rebuild your life into something honest and meaningful. After we hung up, I felt sadness, but not regret. Some relationships, once broken, can't be repaired, but people can still change, grow, and find redemption, even if that redemption doesn't include reconciliation with the people they've hurt. The Foundation's second year brought national attention. A documentary filmmaker contacted us about featuring my story in a film about elder abuse, and several national news programs wanted interviews about family financial exploitation. You've become the face of elder abuse recovery, Jimmy said during one of our board meetings. That's a heavy responsibility. It's a necessary responsibility, I replied. If my story helps one person recognize they're being victimized and gives them the courage to fight back, then everything I went through was worth it. Miguel had started college, but continued working with the foundation during breaks and summers. At 18, he'd developed a passion for elder advocacy that reminded me of Carmen's commitment to helping people heal. I want to be a lawyer, he announced during Christmas dinner at my house, a small gathering that now included Elena Rodriguez, Tommy Nguyen, and several other members of my chosen family. Specifically, I want to specialize in elder law and help families like ours. Families like ours. Families where some people choose crime and others choose justice. I want to be on the justice side. The Foundation's most ambitious project was a statewide educational campaign about recognizing and preventing elder financial abuse. We developed materials for seniors, their families, financial institutions, and law enforcement agencies. The key, I explained during a presentation to bank managers, is understanding that family financial abuse usually starts with small boundary violations that escalate over time. A power of attorney signed for convenience becomes a tool for theft. Concern about mental capacity becomes gaslighting and manipulation. 3 years after the Foundation's launch, we'd helped over 300 families recover stolen assets and provided education to thousands more. But the work that meant the most to me was the weekly support group for elder abuse survivors. "I was ashamed," said Dorothy Chen, whose son had stolen her life savings to fund his gambling addiction. "I thought people would judge me for raising a child who could steal from his own mother. The shame belongs to the people who committed the crimes," I told her, "not to the people who trusted family members they should have been able to trust." The Purple Heart still sat in its place of honor in my bedroom, but now it shared space with letters from people the Foundation had helped, photos from speaking engagements, and certificates recognizing our advocacy work. Carmen's memory had guided every step of this journey, not just her specific wishes about treating our children equally, but her deeper values about justice, fairness, and using whatever advantages you have to help people who are vulnerable. "You know what I think?" Elena said one evening as we sat on my front porch, watching Miguel teach neighborhood kids how to play chess. "I think Carmen would be proud that you turned personal pain into public purpose." "I hope so," I said. "I hope she'd understand why I had to choose justice over family peace." "She'd understand," Elena said with certainty. "Carmen never tolerated bullies, even when the bullies were people she loved." As I looked back on the 4 years since discovering those hidden documents, I realized that my children's betrayal had been both the worst and best thing that could have happened to me. Worst because it destroyed relationships I'd treasured, and forced me to confront the reality that people I loved were capable of calculated cruelty. Best because it forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I still possessed and led me to a purpose that gave meaning to my final years. At 76, I was healthier, more active, and more engaged with life than I'd been since Carmen's death. The Foundation work kept me busy. Martinez Construction continued to thrive under my renewed leadership, and my chosen family of veterans, friends, and Miguel filled the spaces that blood relatives had abandoned. "What's next?" Miguel asked during one of our planning sessions for the Foundation's expansion. "Next, we make sure that no other family goes through what we went through," I said. "We make elder abuse too risky, too public, and too likely to result in serious consequences for criminals to consider it worth trying." "That's a big mission, Abuelo." "I'm a big man with a lot of time left," I said. "And I learned something important. In Vietnam that applies here. The best way to honor the people you've lost is to keep fighting for the values they represented." The Foundation charter hanging on my office wall represented more than a non-profit organization. It represented the transformation of victim into advocate, of personal pain into public purpose, of one man's refusal to be destroyed by the people who should have protected him. Frank Martinez, combat veteran, successful businessman, and survivor of family betrayal, had found his final mission. And unlike the children who tried to steal my legacy, this mission would honor Carmen's memory and my own values long after I was gone. Some battles are fought for survival. Others are fought for justice. The best battles are fought so that future generations won't have to fight them at all. This was one of those battles, and I intended to win it completely.